Hello and welcome to BQ Prime. Just a few days to go for the union budget. On the macro front, it's the usual set of queries. Where will the fiscal deficit for the current fiscal settle at? What will the government target for the next year? How much will the government need to borrow? So on and so forth. This year is also the last full budget ahead of the general elections. Joining us to share his thoughts and expectations from the budget and perhaps what the government priorities should be is Indranil Sengupta, economist and head of research at CLSA. Sir, thank you so much for taking time out.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I'll dive straight into it. So, we've recently had figures for the advanced estimates. And as per that, GDP is estimated to grow 7% in the current fiscal. For nominal GDP, which will be used as the base for the upcoming budget, that's estimated to rise by 15.5%. So, looking at these figures, what do you think the fiscal math for the next fiscal will look like?
So we are looking at a real GDP growth rate of 7%, which is the same as what the government has forecast this year. Next year, we see GDP growth of 5.5% because of a recession in the US and Europe, as well as higher lending rates at home. So we look at a fiscal deficit of around 6.2% this year and 6% next year.
All right. Okay. And would you be of the view that the government should this year focus on fiscal consolidation? How would it work? Because as you mentioned, there's a global slowdown that's in the coming, and at the same time, domestic growth is also expected to ease. So is fiscal consolidation the way to go?
Not really. I mean, this is a year when, like you said, there's a global slowdown. Domestically, lending rates are higher. There's an election next year, so it's very unlikely that the government will opt for fiscal consolidation this year.
All right. Okay. Also, what about spending? Where do you think the government will choose to spend? For instance, the last couple of years, we have seen a continuous thrust on capex. Is that expected to continue?
I think to some extent, yes, but to also, given that, you've had a sort of a Caseshaped recovery. That's what our surveys show. We think that the government will also step up consumer, consumption-based programs, welfare schemes, and we've already seen that, they are obviously, removing prices for food grains under the PDS.
All right. So do your surveys also indicate so we've been reading about how there are signs of green shoots in private capex as seen in multiple indicators, maybe bank credit, for instance. What's your reading of the situation?
We are not looking at a revival of private capex. If growth is slowing, why will there be private capex? So we do not see a revival of private capex this year or next year.
All right. So basically, does that kind of imply that the government will continue to have to do the heavy lifting?
Yeah, I mean, basically consumption is going to be the mainstay of the economy. And, the capex side, it's the government which will have to do the heavy lifting because, growth has been slow, not only in India, all over the world. And when you have slow growth, why will you expand your capacity?
Right. And how much is this expected to be influenced by the impact of monetary policy kicking in next year?
So we are looking at a 50 basis point hike by April and a 100 basis point cut next year, in the second half of next year, once the Fed is done. I think lending rates will go up maybe another 25 basis points this year and pretty much stay flat next year.
All right. Okay. So, we've also, ever since the pandemic, we've been talking about a K-shaped recovery in India. So what is your reading of the situation at this point? Like, is there need for continued support, especially to certain segments of the economy?
Yes, there is, because we did a survey. We do an annual Diwali survey, and we find that the better off sections of the population have come out of COVID. They are actually seeing incomes higher, etc. But the poorer sections are still suffering. So there will probably be, and there surely needs to be, more support for the poorer sections of society.
All right. Any ideas on what form this support could take next year?
So we think that one way out is to provide more subvention to on interest rates to small and micro industries, because they are bearing the brunt of higher lending rates, higher input costs. So some support there is something that we expect, and we've already seen the government reduce the cost of food.
Right. Okay. Also, what about the subsidies front? How is that likely to pan out? We have seen subsidies remaining elevated this year. Is that likely to be the scenario next year as well?
So I think that partly depends on what happens with commodity prices. I don't think that we are in that stage of the economic cycle where the government can cut down subsidies by raising prices, or passing on the burden to the economy, to the average consumer. So to the extent commodity prices come down, we will see lower subsidies. But let's say if oil prices, for example, go up, I doubt that the government is in a position to raise oil prices, or even should raise oil prices.
All right. What's your expectation on the oil price front?
So we think that oil prices may settle somewhere around 95. That's our house. Slightly higher than that.
All right. Okay. And so what else? Like, what are you going to be watching out for in the upcoming budget?
So like I said, that we are looking at a 6% fiscal deficit. We think that there will be some support for consumption. We will obviously watch what is the capex number and what is the pristine capex number shown of this usual transfers. So then those I think are going to be the major things to watch in the budget. We need to see what is the borrowing program and how much the RBI is willing to buy to open market operations, as you see the liquidity in the money market slowly drain away.
All right. So you touched upon capex again. So, while we have seen the government continue to stick to the expected figures when it comes to central spending, state spending has lagged. Do you think that the government might at some point need to introduce or continue incentives to prod states to spend as well? Like, what's happening in that space?
So obviously, if there are more incentivization based programs, that's all very welcome. But we also have to factor in some lags, because projects need to there needs to be due diligence before you take up a project. Oftentimes, when you take up a project, especially if it's a greenfield project, there needs to be some assessment, acquisition of land, and so on and so forth. So it's not like today the money comes and tomorrow the project can start. In many cases.
Right. Okay. Again, on manufacturing, is there also expectation? Do you think what is your reading of the PLI scheme? The impact of the PLI schemes that have been introduced so far, when do you see an impact likely to be visible in the Indian economy? And do you think that the government will continue to maybe demarcate a larger outlay on PLI schemes and introduce more of them?
See, I think PLI schemes, again, yeah, we think that the government will probably try to expand the scope. But then, again, these are not schemes which will happen or materialize into higher growth next year. So, there is again going to be that time lag before the PLI schemes materially contribute to growth.
Okay. So what is the expected drag from exports likely to be at a time when economic growth was weak? We've seen the Indian economy being supported by exports, at least in case of merchandise exports. That support is expected to wane next fiscal. Those services have continued to be fairly steady so far.
Yeah, so exports will obviously get hurt if the US and Europe go into a recession. Typically, we have seen that export growth goes to at least zero. And that is why the cost of a US recession is about 100 basis points on India's GDP. And in fact, the fact that we have growth slowing from 7% to 5.5% is partly driven by that impact of US recession on export demand.
All right. Okay. So that's it at on my front. Absolutely anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered more or less everything.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today.